Hello everyone, and welcome to The Fire These Times. My name is Dana Kurd, and I am co-hosting this episode with ayoub. Today we are joined by two guests, Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor, to discuss their recent essay in The Guardian titled The Rise of End Times Fascism. Our guests don't really need an introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. Naomi Klein is an award-winning best-selling author of many books, as well as professor of climate justice at the University of British Columbia. Her latest book, Doppelganger, was released in September 2023, and won many awards, including the Women's Prize for Nonfiction. We have some episodes where we discuss with her Doppelganger at length, so please make sure to go back and look at those. Astra Taylor is also a very accomplished author. She's written many books, including Democracy May Not Exist, But We'll Miss It When It's Gone, The Age of Insecurity, and many more. She is a documentary filmmaker, as well as writer, as I said, and activist, co-founder of the Debt Collective. They join us today to discuss, as I said, their essay in The Guardian and the implications we can derive from that essay. The essay talks about kind of what the billionaire class is up to, the dangers of AI, and all of the challenges that we're going to see in the near future, or that we're already seeing. And our conversation looks further than that and says, okay, so how are we equipped to fight this? What is the power of our narrative? And it's a really rich conversation that I was glad to be a part of. If you like this episode, like our work, I encourage you to go to patreon.com/fromtheperiphery, become a member, and support the media collective that The Fire These Times is a part of. Without further ado, please enjoy this episode. Thank you both for joining us and for making time. I really enjoyed, or was mostly horrified by the essay in The Guardian. But I think, the themes that y'all brought up are super important to talk about, hence this podcast episode. But so the first kind of basic, pretty broad but simple question is, the Trump administration and its billionaire backers are basically attempting to break everything. And it's this critical juncture where, as you mentioned in the interview, change can really happen, like where the ideas that emerge will really shape, kind of the trajectory of that change. So the simple, yet very broad question is, do we think the left, kind of broadly defined, is prepared with the right ideas to present in this moment?
I think the left is actually more prepared from a policy perspective in a lot of ways than it has been in earlier moments in the neoliberal economic project, when these tactics of exploiting a state of chaos to push through a radical, corporate agenda, which I've called the shock doctrine. I think that there have been moments when the left has been caught much more flat-footed in terms of actually having its own many other things. So I think that the past decade, I'd say, has been quite a fair amount of progress has been made in sort of taking ideas and policy more seriously, that are not just defensive, not just saying stop the cuts. I grew up in the stop the cuts era, as opposed to a
Green New Deal.
Green New Deal, abolition, the work that Astra does with the Debt Collective, right? Like putting our own radical visions on the table. So I do think that we are readier with policy ideas and grand political ideas, but that's not the same as being ready from an organizational standpoint to advance those ideas, or even ready from a narrative affective kind of a standpoint. Because part of what we're talking about when we talk about the apocalypticism on the right, is really marshaling the power of some of the most potent myths, in our culture, not just to advance policy, right, but really getting fire and brimstone on all of this, right, and tapping into that narrative power. And I think that we are still weak on that on the left, and that's part of what Astra and I kind of get to in the latter part of the piece, where we're thinking, okay, well, if what binds together this weird Frankenstein coalition of the sort of Bannonite hyper-nationalists, xenophobes, and the billionaire space colonizers is basically an acceptance that we are at the end of whatever this project is, and we may as well get ready, like with our various bunkers. That should push us to really think about what is our grand narrative about. I've actually found the Bundist idea of here-ness a really powerful one, right? And we quote Molly in the piece, a friend of a pod. So yeah, so I think there's different parts of it, Donna, I would say. It's like there's like the policy piece, I'd say yes, but I would say, this is something Richard Seymour, a point he's made around talking about disaster nationalism is, we're not going to fight like the end times fascist fire with like heat pumps for all, like heat pumps are good, but that's not actually going to capture people's imagination in the same way.
Yeah, I love what Naomi just said about, it's policy is important, but there has to be this prophetic element to it as well. We need that prophetic sense that we have a cause that's bigger than ourselves. I think that's really important. But just to dig into the power problem, which she raised, it's like, yeah, we don't have the power. We're not organized at the scale we need to combat the right for lots of reasons. And this is something we've been saying for a long time. And we are in a period of actively being divided and conquered. So I think that makes this terrain, difficult. And some of those fissures are like, I think Gaza was a huge issue, right? Breaking liberals and leftists. Right. And but also, the Trump administration, like further criminalizing dissent, not that they invented that as a tactic. And so that I think, in that sense, we're on pretty challenging terrain. And also, parts of our policy vision, which was a huge step. I remember I was 20 and I felt like Naomi was the left, it was like, the left was so weak. So now it's like, okay.
That's such a sad state of affairs.
Well, that's why you were so important and still, and still are. But it's like, so now the left has ideas. We know we're kind of popular, right? Like, but that's being actively erased by the abundance agenda, for example, by these liberal ideas that are saying, right, they're almost acting like the Green New Deal never happened, that this idea, that free college for all and the end of student debt wasn't on the table, that there hasn't been a movement demanding healthcare for all for years. So I think that erasure is something that's working against us, and we have to be really vigilant against it and push back.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned Gaza, because that was going to be my follow-up is, in the wake of the genocide that we've seen, it's continued. I think part of why I asked the question is many people in kind of the progressive or leftist space who may have held out hope in some aspect of our institutions and some aspect of our international system are kind of coming down on the side that, actually the entire edifice is rotten. So let's break everything. Let's start anew. And so there is this element of the left, that at least from my perception, that may in fact not be sufficiently outraged when Trump and his billionaire backers break these institutions, because some of these institutions are garbage. This is not specifically this is one example. I'm not saying everything this institution did was garbage, but for example, like USAID, so yeah. What do you think the leftist response should be to all of this breaking what was clearly a biased and deeply problematic, imperfect, global system?
I feel, I guess I have an emotional response, to your question, which is, yeah, it's, I get it. I get the anger people feel at broken institutions. One of my previous books was called Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And this idea that, we can make progress. It's never perfect. It's hard won, but things can go into reverse, right? International human rights is a nice idea. We should try it. I guess one point, I think I guess a core to my sort of leftist philosophy is that you don't get those sort of beacons of liberalism like international human rights frame, like, basic welfare state, without an underlying framework of socialism, right? Of economic equality and those kinds of commitments. So for me, I don't know. I guess I'm saying that I think the cheering the breaking of broken things is a risky place to be. Right now, I'll be very specific about student debt cancellation and higher education. I've been fighting for student debt abolition for the last 10 years. And right now, the Trump administration is taking the student lending system and making it even more punitive, disastrous, punishing for working class people, right? Taking that apparatus and not really abolishing it, abolishing what were kind of the somewhat helpful parts and keeping the parts that extract wealth from working and middle class communities. And so now we're in a tension where we have to say, oh, stop, protect this thing we wanted to eliminate before so that we can have a better chance building a movement that fights for our big vision of democratic higher education. And so that's just one of those, it's one of those tensions that we have to inhabit, I think, as organizers who really do want to have a real impact and improve people's lives. And, it can, just feel shitty to have defend something that is imperfect, and imperfect doesn't even describe it. Sometimes, that has aspects of its institutional structure that's actively harmful. But, it's one of those laws of the universe, I think, that's easier to destroy than to build, and we're working against that. It's tough. But right now I'm really feeling that in my own arena of work, which is we're having to do this dual movement of trying to protect and push forward, of trying to protect and defend while also saying this was never adequate. It's not.
I also think I don't think there's one answer. I think it really depends on the thing that's being broken. And, USA is not a monolith, right? There are some good things that happen in the USA, but I think there are some things that Doge and Trump are destroying that are just unequivocally just going to make people's lives far more miserable, their lives shorter, just spreading death, this week, I don't know when this is going to air, but RFK Jr. announced that pregnant women are no longer going to be recommended to get the COVID vaccine. That's going to kill babies and that's, it's incredibly ironic because all these folks are so pro-life, right? But, a basic understanding of what happens to an immune system that is pregnant, and so this combination of recommending that kids don't get the vaccine, that pregnant mothers don't get the vaccine is just going to mean death, and it's just one example. So I just think that's a straightforward thing, but I feel very fortunate not to live in the United States. I live in Canada. My parents left during the Vietnam War. Grateful to them. I think, one of the things I'm focused on is what places that are not living under Trump, what our responsibilities are in terms of making good on some of the bullshit liberalism that our governments are still spouting. What does that mean in terms of what we should be fighting for? How can we do a better job of kind of exploiting this anti-Trump discourse that you're hearing from, right now, Canada, has a double central banker as its new prime minister, but he's doing this whole kind of elbows up, fighting Trump, but he's just going to do Trump light in Canada, right? But that doesn't mean that we don't have opportunities, right, to kind of make good on some of the anti-Trumpism that's being unleashed. And I think that that's very true in the multilateral arena. The U.S. influence, whether it's Democrats or Republican, on the internationals in multilateral spaces, almost without exception, is terrible, right? It is good. More things will be possible now that they're gone, but we have to organize for it. We have to organize for it across borders and, thinking about it in terms of the climate space. The only thing the U.S. government has done in the climate space has been watered down agreements, make them meaningless, make them non-binding, put in shitty market mechanisms. Yeah. So now that our governments outside the U.S. don't have that excuse, what are we going to do with that? You know what I mean? So, yeah.
That divergence is an opening.
Yeah, maybe if we organize for it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and we can't get stuck in, the last thing we want to do is get stuck in something where we appear or by default are defending the status quo, which is broken, right? And I think that is the trap that liberals in the States fell into. It's we must save
Astra,
our democracy.
Astra, how did you feel when Trump said he wanted to take the money from Harvard and give it to trade schools? I thought that was a pretty great idea.
I'm like, that is right. But the thing is
you're like, darn it, Trump said it.
But the reality is everything, when I said they're rehauling the student lending system, they are creating a field day for-profit predatory trade schools, right? These aren't even schools. They're these companies that purport to offer skills and are in, these Wall Street, sometimes private equity backed firms. So, it's the right words, right? But when you look under under the hood, it's just, oligarchic, destructive, horrible. It's the worst version of it. But I think it's, it's like the right sentiment.
Is it an opportunity to be like, yeah, community colleges, should be 100% free. Let's invest, I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud, but like, sometimes when people lie, it's an opportunity to like
you can push the
100%, 100%. And there's a lie that contains truth, because he's right that there's a vast injustice in the endowment possessed by Harvard and in the resources going to these schools. So I think so. I think that we have to, build the power to call the bluff and put something else on the table. And that it just is a lot of work to do that. But it is our obligation to try to turn these crises into an opportunity. Like, they're not just opportunities. We have to make them into that. And I think that's the moral imperative of this kind of moment.
Especially in an environment where these opportunities apparently are never ending, to constant crises. Sorry, Ilya, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to add, I guess the example for me that comes to mind is that you ask most Palestinian refugees and they have more than enough to complain about any kind of UN agency, especially like UNRWA and stuff. But you take UNRWA away and things are so much worse. It's not because UNRWA itself was this amazing thing or is this amazing thing. It's just that there are no alternatives. And that is why the Israelis, of course, have used their attacks on UNRWA as part of this genocide. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered in the first place.
But coming back to thinking about what the betrayals of Palestinians have contributed to the weakness of any kind of coalition, right? That could respond to these accumulations of crisis. I mean, I really think we have to spend time on it. We have to really think about it. Think about what repair would mean. Because even just using words like apocalypticism, end times, like the end times are here. The apocalypse is here. It's just unevenly distributed, like all aspects of the future, right? And so I think that when you have a lot of sort of American liberals going, we're about to have fascism, we're about to have an apocalypse, and you have a whole generation going, where have you been? And if we don't try to bridge those two worlds and understandings of where we are and temporalities of where we are, I think we're going to stay stuck.
The frameworks of, for example, It Could Happen Here, which is a podcast I enjoy and I've been on and stuff, but I said it on that podcast as well, is that you have places that it has already happened. And there is, of course, an entire conversation to be had. And I mean, to be fair, they are pretty good at that, I would say, of understanding and kind of decentering ourselves when it feels that it is currently happening here. Like Lebanon, the 2020 felt like it was the apocalypse with obviously the pandemic and stuff, but also the Port of Beirut explosion. It felt like this was it. And then we're right now in Lebanon, if I talk to friends and stuff, it feels like we're talking about the post-apocalypse. We're not talking about the apocalypse anymore. It's like this is the day after. Which doesn't mean that things can't get worse, of course, and stuff, but it's kind of like allowing ourselves, or trying in any case, to inhabit these multiple temporalities or political temporalities at the same time, which isn't easy to do, but certainly it has to be done. The conversation I had with Maram Hamed, who's this journalist in Gaza, just like a few days ago, and we released it a few days ago. Again, it's kind of maybe this drastic, I don't know what the word, but maybe this extreme example, but it's also not. It's just right now, her day-to-day is what it is, and it is very difficult to imagine. We had a lot of difficulties recording it and whatnot, but she has to adapt to what is happening. She doesn't have a choice. She has 2 kids as well. She has to think about them and stuff. This entire thing where like we recorded, my friend and I, Isra, and after that, okay, we said goodbye to Maram and stuff. And then it was just me and Isra because we had to record this introduction. And then we had to take like an hour break to do the introduction because we were just like out of words. We didn't know how to even express things because the urgency in her voice is in my mind. Like I don't have this urgency on a day-to-day basis, but I had to inhabit that urgency, if that makes sense, while talking to her in order to also empathize and make sense of it all as much as I could.
Masha Gessen has a piece out today in the New York Times about how we normalize these crises. And seems like a disaster, but you can always kind of metabolize that disaster. You can always kind of get past that disaster. And it's a human impulse to try to adapt and continue living, but it does blunt the urgency of the moment, and it blunts the urgency of our ability to mobilize effectively. And actually that's a good segue to what I've been thinking about related to mobilization, specifically in the United States, post-second term Trump, to distinguish from the first time. And we've talked a lot about Harvard, but the Counting Crowds Consortium at Harvard has been collecting data on like the level of mobilization across time and space. They have a whole research project even on the pro-Palestine protests, which has been very interesting to follow over time. But what their findings show is that in the first few months of 2025, people mobilized in the United States more than in the entirety of 2017. How do we absorb that information, given everything we've talked about with in terms of the urgency, but how people can also normalize these crises? Like, are people starting to understand that these are end times and there's like a nihilistic vision here? Or is this mobilization being used ineffectively? Pretty interested in your thoughts on that. Either of you.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question and something I'm living with every day as an organizer and trying to figure out how we can do better as a left. I mean, I was heartened by that data that said that more people were turning out and going into the streets. And, I've been part of the protests since the second Trump inauguration. I worry eternally that we, mistake mobilizing and people going into the streets for power. And I think that's an incredibly critical point. So this is a both and. It's not a dismissing of protests, because I think protests are a kind of social proof that there are other people who care. They can be enormous demonstrations. I think enormous demonstrations of discontent. And I think the presence of the protests, this administration, changed the media narrative, right? Because there was a sense like, oh, well, he's legitimate this time. He won the popular vote.
He has a mandate.
He has a mandate, but power takes infrastructure. Power takes, it takes sort of strategic focus more than going out in the streets. And I feel that people are coming when people come to the mass Zooms we do, when people go to meetings I attend, it's like, well, what else are we doing? I've been to the protests, right? What else am I doing to build power, to really change things, to win that Green New Deal, to win that free college, to win an economy that's not controlled by the billionaires? So that's tricky. I mean, I think, we also need to grow the tent. I mean, mobilizing tends to mobilize the people who are already on your side. And so this I just want to say something on this note of temporalities that I think is so important. Like, people are in different places of their political journey. And for me, part of I have to remind myself of this because I'm human and I'm an introvert and I get annoyed with people all the damn time. But it's like, we're trying to build power to change the political system, to change our societies, to change the world. But like, that requires a faith that people can change too, that people aren't set in stone. And in this moment, it's so frustrating. It's like, we were telling you what Gaza meant, right? That this was not something just out there. I think, but we have to walk people through a kind of political awareness, right? To understand the connections more deeply. I mean, this is I think a really powerful moment to say, hey, the movements for racial justice and after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, like those, that what we were saying about structural racism hurting everybody. Like, look at this. They're using DEI to gut environmental protections, to gut the welfare state, to unleash corporate power. Like, white supremacy is apocalyptic for everybody. It turns out you've lost your job. I live in Western North Carolina where, we had a big hurricane last year. I was just reading in the paper about all of the AmeriCorps people who were just kicked out of work as waste, fraud, and abuse by Doge. And what struck me was that these people who are in their 20s and like cleaning people's basements and stuff and cleaning out the forest so there'd be less risk of forest fires in the future and stuff, they were working for $300 a week and a per diem to eat of $6.10 in the United States.
And this is the waste.
And this is the waste, but they're being disposed of because of DEI, right? Because of wokeism and stuff. And so it's just it's like, this is a moment where there's just, again, opportunity, political education to see, do you see that this racism it's not something that just affects other people who aren't your community, right? It's here in the hills of Western North Carolina. It's across the country. So, I think
I will say,
sorry.
Oh,
yeah, go for it.
Just very briefly, I saw that very normie liberal white professors are now talking about abolishing ICE. So that felt heartening, I will say. Sorry to cut you off, Naomi. I just wanted to share that good news.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that gets me down is just that I'm not sure we really are engaging in the kind of introspection that a lot of us were hoping was going to happen after the election, where, Astra and Kiang Imana Taylor and Chandra Komanika and I have these periodic, mega Zooms with Haymarket Books. And we had one right after the election and, one a few weeks later. And there was really definitely like feeling like an opening of like, part of what happened here was that we were irrelevant, in this election. Like whatever we were doing as the left was easy enough to vilify, was not connecting with people, was sort of experienced as censorious and scolding and exclusive and elitist enough that it was possible to turn way more working class people, including a lot of young people and people of color who had not voted for Trump before. And so and there was definitely the feeling of like, we have to look in the mirror, and we have to do better. And we have to be, Kianga used this word, like we need a welcoming left. And I think that word is really important. Welcoming. It's not a dogmatic word, right? But I think it's just a natural part of feeling under siege is your horizons shrink, right? And so then it once again becomes, well, how can I make the most maximalist demand of the smallest group of people? So I don't know. I don't know. Just a few things have happened that have made me wonder whether we are learning that lesson, and we really have to learn that lesson. Now, part of what we're doing with the anti-fascism framing, right, and it's real. When we're connecting the dots between the Christian Zionists, who believe in a literal end times in Palestine, and that's part of how they welcome, not just rationalize, but welcome the genocide. And part of how that connects with the attacks on trans bodies is all about sort of hatred of the corporeal. But then that kind of rhymes with the fantasies of AI and uploading your intelligence into the AI singularity. And it's all about, abandoning this place, right? So part of what we are trying to think about is like, is there a sort of a meta story that could galvanize us, excite us, have that kind of prophetic vision about really committing to the animate world, right? And I really do believe that what is happening with AI is something we all have to pay a lot more attention to, because I actually think this is something that we can work with and peel away a lot of people who we lost, because the hypocrisy is just, I don't think I've ever seen anything like the hypocrisy of the populist right around the world claiming they're going to fight for the working class, and then immediately turning around and backing this technology that is going to do away with jobs and is already doing away with jobs on an unfathomable scale. That is a absolutely vampiric technology in the sense that it is draining the very lifeblood of the animate world, right? Water, energy, the habitability of communities in order to build these disgusting data centers, right? So that they can, no one is asking for this. It's all being foisted on us. Every search we now do, you don't have to ask for AI. They foist it on us and they burn the energy and they suck the water to do it. So I don't know. I actually think this could be a kind of a reset for the left. I think we have an opportunity.
Not a great reset, just a reset.
Talk about this. I play right into the right-wing conspiracy. You have to be a little bit, internet builds to know what we're all laughing about. But yeah, the right believes that we want a great reset, and they're right.
Our audience will get it.
Yeah, I mean, we were just texting. I was just like, it's amazing the right has built this coalition where there's like, you will not replace us like ethno-nationalists, and then you will be replaced by AI. Techno enthusiasts.
And you will love it. Thank you, Trump.
And you will love it. Yeah. And this is the reason, I mean, this is your terrain, Naomi, but the reason Bannon goes on and on about AI is like, because this is not something that speaks to people on a gut level. This is not what they want for their kids. Nobody wants to be,
But Bannon is deeply full of shit. He knows he needs to say that he's against this because his base is so against it.
Yes.
But he's in bed with all of these tech companies. He was in bed with the Mercers in 2016, who are, early adopters of this or foisters of this. So he's saying just enough so that his base doesn't rebel against him. So this is why I'm saying it's an opportunity for us, because they're scared. They're really, really scared of how untenable this is. So I'm a little bit obsessed about that, because I think it's also beautiful. It's really about, we have to help people fall in love with the world again. you know?
Yeah. No, I mean, just to reiterate what was just said, but I think the left sometimes has a tendency to be like, it's about being righteous and right. And I think I think what Naomi's saying is there's a task of reenchantment, right? Like that's actually as important as just having the arguments or, the right position on something, and there's so much to wonder at. And, we actually, research on the internet shows that what gets people to click is like outrage or awe. And I feel like we just need to have both in our mix as we're trying to appeal to people's sensibilities.
The awe way, what is it? Awe rage.
Yeah, that would be good.
The
rage that they're destroying this awe-inspiring world, right? That's
for them
that's
and for their children.
Yeah.
For what? For AI slop. I mean, this is the thing, you think about like when we were like the amount of energy that this is requiring, and also the attacks on democracy that are happening, right? They bundled into this mega bill that states and municipalities are literally not allowed to regulate AI. It's wild.
For 10 years, they've preempted any regulations. Yeah.
So, and so they can use as much water and they can use as much energy as they want. They're building this in a lot of red states, right? Very red areas. So this is like the opportunities for coalition are really broad because you can spin it however you want. But if people are turning on their taps and they have no water pressure because some massive data center down the road is sucking up all of their resources, it doesn't actually matter what Steve Bannon says.
At people's lived experiences, this data center is like destroying my soundscape and not giving me water. And of course, that's a golden opportunity, I would say.
That's why I find myself a bit at odds at time, because I do find a lot of this weirdly hopeful, and I do make the distinction between hopeful and optimistic, because I'm not an optimist, but I try to be hopeful. There's a lot of contradictions in what they're trying to do. I mean, we've listed quite a lot of them here, and one of the examples that you obviously make is, Musk being so obsessed with colonizing Mars and clearly not having any actual love for the planet that he is actually living in, that we are sharing with, and so on. And part of the crisis, part of the problem, and here I'll just quote a bit, our task is to build a wide and deep movement, as spiritual as it is political, strong enough to stop these unhinged traitors, a movement rooted in a steadfast commitment to one another across our many differences and divides, and to this miraculous singular planet. And that's, for me, something I've been kind of going back to from time to time, even in conversations that are not necessarily about that. Like the one I had with Marley on Doikite ended up actually us ranting about AI as well. And there's an element of, because there is, I don't know how to say this, we have certain tools we have a lot of tools in our disposal, and a lot of the problem, I'm not going to say it's the only problem, and I don't want to downplay the actual damage being done every day and whatnot, but we also tend to downplay or underestimate what we can do. And more, also as importantly, when we do succeed in achieving something, there is also a tendency I found, and I mean, I do this as well, in kind of immediately moving on, like not actually kind of taking stock with the fact that we have actually achieved something that is important. There are a lot of things that even the right basically has adopted from the left. And that is in some sense a victory. And of course it is not one, but it is worth kind of pondering, or at least worth reflecting on, when we are efficient, or when we are, efficiency is kind of whatever, when we are successful, I guess, in shaping the culture and shaping how people think about what is possible and whatnot, those are lessons in and of themselves. Like, we're not necessarily reinventing the wheel effectively. Because I have a feeling, the reason I'm saying this, and I'm probably expressing this not as well as I could, is that this kind of doom and gloom, this hopelessness, which again is not the same as pessimism or whatever, I have found it to be, other than exhausting and self-defeating, this might sound a bit mean, and I don't mean it that way necessarily, but sometimes a bit of a cop-out. Like, sometimes a way of like avoiding the hard, just reality, the fact that this is very complicated, this is very messy,
and
that
if we
it requires work. And I mean, I ranted about this just today on Blue Sky, but on Gaza, people who give up on Gaza, it pisses me off. Like, I think it's something that, like, it's not something that we should allow ourselves to feel. Feeling tired and exhausted, burnout, needing to take a break, all of that is normal and fine. But to kind of accept the kind of, which is effectively what it is, like the end goal of what the Israelis are declaring that they want to do. I don't know how we're I'm saying we here. I don't know how a lot of people have sort of accepted that this is what they're saying, that they want to ethnically cleanse 95% and put everyone in a concentration camp in the south and whatnot. And how horrible is that? And then, of course, we complain about it and we call them genocidal Nazis and so on and whatever. We can do that, but it doesn't mean that it is inevitable that they manage to do that. It doesn't mean that there aren't things, that pressure points that we can actually put and whatnot. I mean, this is more in depth in other episodes that we do, but this is something that comes to mind time and time again. Of course, Gaza is always on my mind now. That's just an example I'm using, but it can really be applied to so many others of the topics that we're talking about. Like canceling that could happen. Like we could actually manage to do that, and not regardless, but like even with the worst people in power, like those, or at least there are certain mechanisms that we can use to apply pressure points. And yeah, I'm ranting a bit, but
One thing
giving up is something that I've gotten more angry, if you want, in recent weeks, as also things have gotten worse in Gaza, because people in Gaza don't have that. Again, I'm using that example, but people in Gaza just do not have that luxury, do not have that option in the first place. So I don't know why we should pretend like we do.
What I would say, Ilya, is that, and I'd be interested in Donna's take on this as well, because it's something we've talked about before, but like, I think we both don't have the right to give up, nor do we have the right to not examine our own tactics and not try to come up with new tactics, right? If our old tactics aren't working, or haven't worked, right? Like both of those are duties of the atrocities. And part, I have felt, and many others do as well, that part of the work, being in solidarity with Palestinians under a genocide, or not under a genocide, under occupation, under apartheid, is the work of de-exceptionalization, right? Because the entire Zionist narrative is a narrative of exceptionalism, right? That the Holocaust was entirely exceptional from other genocides, and that therefore rationalized an exception from the post-war international humanitarian legal consensus. And so when we de-exceptionalize, whether we're doing the work with historical de-exceptionalism and tracing continuities from settler colonialism to the Holocaust, which isn't the same as saying that it's the same, but it is placing the Holocaust in history, right? Is that I think part of what is fertile about understanding the apocalypticism of the narrative and the connections between these different aspects of the right is that it is a reframe, right? It is a way of understanding what is happening in Gaza within the context of a broader war, not just on the future, but on the here. There's a difference between a war on the future and a war on the here, right? Like Walter Benjamin warned, right, that people are more motivated to avenge their ancestors, and the losses and the martyrs than they are to fight for an amorphous future, right? But I think people are very motivated to protect this place, like the here-ness of this planet, which also means avenging and redeeming, or redeeming in Benjamin's terms, right? Redeeming the defeats of our movement ancestors, right? So I just think it might be helpful too, I just want to stress, this isn't about moving on from Palestine, right? It's absolutely, somebody who really helped me understand that was, and we quote her in the piece, is the singer Naomi, who I had the opportunity to interview, and I asked her about what she saw as the connection between the apocalypticism and I asked her what she saw as the connection between the attacks on the earth and the anti-climate policies of the Trump agenda, and Trump elected, and the anti-trans agenda. Mm-hmm. And her response was that they're both attacks on the body, and they're both part of the narrative of the rapture. It's all about trying to be free of the body, whether it's the physical body or the world as body, right? And that was so helpful to me to understand Zionism.
Yeah, I had written a piece on the punishing the land. They're also like they're harming Gaza as a land as well, in addition to, of course, doing and killing and harming human beings. And that has been part of the project in the first place. It is this obsession with what is existing, what is right now, what is here. It's not just that we can just take it. No, we have to destroy it first. We have to, rebuild anew, etc. I'll briefly mention that I had a recent episode with Amos Goldberg, who's this Israeli historian of the Holocaust, and he's one of the most vocal Israelis who have called this a genocide. And the reason I'm bringing him up here is that he had this very interesting, we talked about a paper that he wrote last year. He had this very interesting passage in that paper that took me aback a bit when I read it, which is that he is in the field, and like his studies is comparative genocide studies, including the Holocaust. So that's what he does. That's kind of his academic field. And he found that a number of the historians of the Holocaust who previously, before October 2023, were saying that the Holocaust is unique and cannot be compared to anything else, were very happy to compare Hamas to the Nazis and to say that Israel are fighting the new Nazis. They actually kind of broke their own rule effectively. Whereas it's people like him who from the beginning were in this comparative field, had no kind of problem saying, well, like, this is not Auschwitz, but it is still genocide. Like, this is not the Holocaust, but it is still genocide. And there are these other, all these other ways in which it can be genocide and so on. So this is just a conversation we had on that. And it spoke to the urgency of the moment. And I will also say, like, Dan and I have had like conversation, also including on this podcast, of the problems that come when the Palestinian cause is exceptionalized and even fetishized. Dana and I are both Palestinian, and she also grew up in Jerusalem. And this is something that we found has harmed the cause. This is like even long before the genocide, harmed the cause in making connections with, for example, the Syrian revolution or with Sudanese, and I'm just talking about the region here, let alone the broader world. And it has been more of a problem of the non-Palestinian spaces that are pro-Palestine than of Palestinians, although there's that problem as well within our spaces as well, who have been overall, I would say on average, more willing to make these connections. But it has been still a problem.
Just to reflect on the conversation on this point, yeah, it's almost like, well, I think you're right that this is an issue that non-Palestinian spaces that are in solidarity with Palestine have, but also Palestinian spaces, especially, I would say there's kind of a disconnect between the diaspora and people in the region. But speaking, from my positionality in the United States, like, I've talked about this before, it's almost like for the sake of like maintaining a correct tactic or a correct line, kind of a pure line on this issue, they're almost willing to sacrifice Gazans or Palestinians to more genocide. And I think people don't fully recognize that the Israeli state's narrative is this ethno-nationalist singular narrative of what this conflict means, both to them and for us. So de-exceptionalizing not only our understanding of what's happening right now, so not, again, like you said, Naomi, like, not because we want to move on from Palestine, but because Palestine is in fact one part of this broader struggle against end times fascism, but also to exceptionalize like the future we can imagine, which means like expanding our narrative to include more richness of kind of, human existence, that the kind of ethno-nationalist singular narrative wants to flatten. And because of the genocide and because of the fractured left to some degree, I think people have fallen back on kind of those more limiting narratives and exceptionalize the issue, fetishize the issue. And I understand where it comes from, especially if you're in the diaspora, you feel you just feel disempowered. But there's kind of a medium to long term kind of problem with that track that I think sets up the Palestinians or sets up a lot of people for more violent outcomes. And I just want to recommend to listeners this novel by Etel Adnan called Sitt Marie Rose that I recently just finished, translated from French, and it was written during the Lebanese Civil War. And already back then she was, writing in these terms. She's saying, there are these narratives that are causing so much mass violence, and there was this line from the novel where she says, "God, whoever you are, protect the future generations from the genocide that awaits them." This was written back, in the 1970s. So,
Etel was a pretty well-known Lebanese feminist and openly queer novelist. Not a lot of them. So she lived like
painter
good age, like in the
and
90s.
poet.
Painter, yeah. He's a pretty remarkable person. Yeah, sorry, just wanted to add that.
Anyway, Astra.
And also, I you said what I wanted to say, Dana, just better. So thanks.
I want to hear Naomi's response. I mean, what you both said was so incredibly powerful. I just wanted to maybe put it in the language of the End Times Fascism piece, because that piece is all about bunkering and how, in response to this recognition on the right that climate change is real, that the industries that create their wealth are earth destroying, population destroying industries, right? AI, fossil fuels, the military industrial complex, that they've decided to bank on destruction, literally, because it increases the amount of money in their bank account, but that they also, of course, want to survive it, right? Whether that's in a literal kind of vision of the rapture because they're religious, or if that's a secular version, or if it's going to be in their luxury bunker. And so the bunker is a major theme, the sort of bunker nation, the idea of, sovereign city-states bunkering. And what we're talking about is the bunkering of stories, right? That's what exceptionalism is. It's like, well, my story is separate from yours. And so anyway, hearing you reflect, I was like, there's a narrative dimension, right, to this severing. And, solidarity doesn't thrive under those conditions. Solidarity is about reaching across difference, finding commonalities without erasing differences, so that we can find allies, and build that future where nobody has to endure a genocide.
Just building on what Astra was saying, that's really key is, and that surprised me in the research for the piece, was that people in Silicon Valley who are not primarily Zionists and might have no relationship with Israel whatsoever, but are really interested in this bunkered project. Sometimes they want to create their own private cities. Some of them refer to it as tech Zionists. They see the parallel very, very clearly. Now, then there are people like Alexander Karp, who, is the CEO of Palantir, who's building all kinds of weapons for Israel, and clearly sees he is both a Zionist and a tech Zionist, right? But these things it's just such an international project, right? And it is so kind of porous, right, in terms of the people that we're up against. And I think that we are used to talking about it in a very linear way of just like, okay, these people are Zionists. They have they've adopted these policies because they want Israel to exist as it is. But what we're seeing is it's more than that. They actually want many Israels, right? This is how they bunker, right? And Israel is the ultimate bunker, right? And that's why October 7th is the ultimate shattering shock, because it means that the bunker's not holding, right? And so they all lose their minds completely. And so one doesn't cancel out the other. It doesn't mean that Zionism isn't an incredibly powerful ideology that is animating the project, but I think that it's important to also understand what Israel represents as a high-tech fortress state, right? Surrounded, quote unquote, surrounded by enemies, right? That is that. And if you can survive that, then you can survive the future, right? Because the future, that's their vision of what the future is going to look like. Yeah, and then the only other thing I was just going to say was just in response to what you were saying, Donna, like, I do understand it emotionally that if you've been subjected to the Palestine exception your whole life, right, and been surrounded by people who claim to believe certain things with an asterisk next to it, and that asterisk is you, how it would make sense to respond to an exception with an exception, right? But that, like,
they're sequestering themselves.
And it's also an example of this kind of mirroring and doppelganging that we were talking about last time, which is just this trap, right?
It's a good segue because I want to talk a bit about this whole bunkering thing, and it's going to sound unconnected, but it is not unconnected. I just have ADHD. And the movie World War Z that came out some years ago, part of the plot that occurs there is that you have this zombie apocalypse. It's this, post-apocalyptic world or apocalyptic world and so on. And at some point, you have this CIA officer and Brad Pitt, who is another intel, whatever, and they go to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, they work with the Mossad and they work with IDF and so on, because there is this invasion by zombies that are kind of threatening to overtake Jerusalem. And so what the Israelis do in Jerusalem is that they create a fortress around Jerusalem to keep these zombies out. And it's not rocket science to kind of see where the metaphors come, given that there is an apartheid wall in Israel-Palestine in the first place. But those imageries, kind of this image of like they're coming, whoever that they are, usually it's like zombies or whatever, they're coming from the outside and they're about like kind of these invading hordes, right? It's not even like a new metaphor necessarily, this new imagery. And what we need to do is to protect our own, whatever that even means. And then, of course, what they consider our own is like increasingly or rather decrease, like smaller and smaller and smaller. But one thing that kind of baffles me a lot when I think about I spent way too much time, which is probably not good for my mental health, but looking at like what Peter Thiel's bunker is supposed to look like and what these people have in mind. It was one of like underground bunker cities, whatever, and so on. Is the only thing that kept popping on my mind when I was reading those, reading these and even seeing the illustrations that they were imagining it would look like, is like this will not work. Like this cannot functionally work. Like just rationally, objectively, I put all of my emotional side aside. There's nothing in what they're building that is remotely meant to like last. So even
be human.
Yeah, like even in their bunkerization, even when they think of their like future proofing whatever, they're not doing a very good job at understanding what makes a human, like how the fact that they seem to have these difficulties in imagining what the world could look like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever, beyond just basically, a zombie apocalypse, but like without the zombies. For me, weirdly enough, this is why I find some hope in that if their projects are doomed to fail, it gives me at least some mental space to think of like, what can we do in the meantime? Not in this passive way, like, they're just doomed to fail and we cannot do anything about it. But not to drag myself down too much and believing in what they are projecting and what they think the world should be like. Again, this bunkerization. I take it for what it is, and it is a danger and it is a threat because of how it is affecting our world. But I don't accept their conclusions as a given, effectively. For me personally, at least, allows me to at least have some mental flexibility or whatever, mental space, I guess, to think of like, okay, well, what can we do in the meantime to accelerate their decline, make them maybe more irrelevant in the long term? Like, what are the structural things that we need to change? And also, what are the things that we personally need to create, like as an alternative, regardless of their bunkerization, if any of this makes sense?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's very true. And I think this is why it's always worth remembering what Astra was saying before about that this is first and foremost about the bank. It's about the fact that their business models are incredibly profitable, and they want to keep. They're addicted to this level of wealth accumulation, and they're terrified of it. I think that there's a way in which they can't believe they're getting away with it. One of the things that we came across in the research was the fact that Peter Thiel has said repeatedly that he believes that the Antichrist is Greta Thunberg, which is a wild thing to say, but he has said it multiple times. And he explains that it's because if Greta is right about in what she is saying, that we all need to ride bicycles, which isn't what Greta is saying, but he claims that this is what she's saying, that this would require a one world government that would be so repressive that is what, it's foretold that the Antichrist is going to do. But really all this is a window into the way his mind works, which is that I really think they can't believe they're getting away with it. And they're sort of waiting for us to stop them. And, I mean, I guess it's another way that we could try to find some hope. I really don't think they believe that we're not coming for them, which is why they're coming up with these ever more bizarre fantasies of how they're going to get away from us, right? We're the zombies, obviously, in this story.
Yeah. We're always the zombies.
It's because they need to hide from the pitchforks in those bunkers, right? And they need an AI doctor because they don't even want to risk having a real human physician, right? So Naomi shared this amazing piece that was, advertising one of these future shelters, right? That would be equipped with this whole concierge service, including, your robot healthcare. To me, what you mentioned inevitability before.
Good. Let them have the AI. Sorry, let them have the AI robots. That's a good thing for us. They should have those AI robots. That's a good thing. They would not survive them.
See how it goes. But you brought up inevitability in your question just now and before. And I think that, first you talked about the inevitability that some say on the left, right? The sense that we're losing in advance, right? That things are inevitably getting so bad. And, we need to push back on that because, movements don't happen overnight, right? I mean, we can look back on history and say there's lots of points where if people had just given up on the abolition of slavery or the enfranchisement of women, right? And that would have looked like the rational thing to do, right? Where would we be today? But these guys use inevitability in a different way. I mean, so part of the Silicon Valley marketing has always been like, this stuff's happening and you can't stop it. And if you're someone who's trying to regulate it, you're a Luddite and you're anti-progress, because this is it. The locomotive of history is moving. forward. And that's bullshit. It's not inevitable. It's not inevitable that, our destinies are just to like click on their ads all day. And so, Naomi invokes Walter Benjamin earlier. And it's like, one thing he said is, was something like basically a revolutionary, like pulls the brake on the locomotive, right? I mean, it's just like, no, we don't, we're not doing this. It's not inevitable. And so that's where the hype, AI is real, but it's also not what they're saying it is, right?
It's also not something, I just want to reiterate, it's not something anyone is asking for.
Yes.
Right? It reminds me of the globalization debates, in the 90s of, which, some of you are too young to remember, but it was like they had to tell this story that would make people okay with the fact that the factories were closing in huge numbers and all the jobs were leaving, right? And so they had a story, and the story was there was going to be so much growth and the markets were going to expand and everybody was going to get rich. But they can't tell a story like that about AI. They can't, because we're too cynical now. We're like, nobody believes that, right? Nobody believes that Sam Altman wants them to have a life of leisure, where they're going to have, get paid to make art or whatever it is. And why would they make art anyway? Because AI is making all the art, right? So this is why, we tried to bring some fire and brimstone to our article. We can just kind of shake people a little bit because, these people are traitors. They're treasonous to this world and the wonders of this world. They're not traitors to nation. They're traitors to creation. That should fill us with a righteous fury, right? That is, a combination, a rage at the desecration of that project, and just a fierce love for, everything that is on the line, which is everything, right?
And each other.
Yeah. If this can't wake up the left, I don't know what can, honestly. We're all tired, I get it, but it's go time, like Adrian Brown said, this is it. This is what all we've been preparing for, is this moment.
Well, what you just did, Naomi, is giving the perfect excuse to end my intervention with Baldwin, because I like to do that. And he was talking about how he cannot afford to be, the way he put it, is a pessimist. I would describe his optimism as what I would call hopeful. But the reason for that is, for me, if someone like him, and I'm just using him as an example, Octavia Butler's the same thing, as he was literally the grandson of a slave, of an enslaved person. He still managed to see through that and understand that the problem was not him. The problem was the society that was imposing this white supremacist vision of the world on him. And he basically said he cannot afford to lose faith. And here I'm paraphrasing. And even if you know a few people, even if you only know a handful of people who haven't given up hope or whatever, that is still enough. That is still important, and you shouldn't erase those people effectively. And that is otherwise it would be a betrayal of many, many people, is how he put it. That would be a quote. So I just wanted to end on that. We can kind of slowly wrap up. I know we kind of come to the hour and stuff. One kind of, you sort of answered that anyway, but maybe I'll give you more space if you want. Of what are certain things that do make you hopeful about the current world? And if not, specifically what is happening right now in terms of maybe very concrete potentials, basically, that's coming out of the cracks of the world we live in, effectively. An easy question.
My answer is really humble in the sense that, I take a lot of hope, to use your word, or it's sort of, I like the Miriam Kaba quote that hope is a discipline, right? It's something that you have to do every day. Sometimes you've got to seek out your source. And for me, it's the daily work of being part of the Debt Collective and just seeing all these people who I have a lot of respect for, who could be doing other things. Some of them could be making a lot more money in other fields, and they're organizing every day, and they're trying to bring people in. They're trying to build that welcoming left, and to invite people in the door of our movement. And there are many days where I'm like, I don't want to get on the damn Zoom. I would rather just doom scroll or eat soup or whatever. And, I almost always feel better afterwards. So I think that this is why I think it's so important for people to find a political home, because sometimes just that daily glimpse of other people being good and doing good and having that, optimism of the intellect and and of the will, actually putting that into practice. I don't know, to me, that's my source. So every time I see people just doing the work, I feel a bit better.
I felt really hopeful when I was just at the Jewish Voice for Peace national membership meeting. It's the first time they've had a national membership meeting in, I think, definitely since before the pandemic. And there were 2,000 people there. And it just felt really defiant in the face of the repression and criminalization. And it was really just about organizing in coalition for a breakthrough. And there were just so many amazing people there. And it felt strong. And it also felt like I get a lot of hope from these kinds of unearthings, or maybe you would call them hauntings, of the work of people who are uncovering lost histories so that we have more company, so that we're able to draw on more sources of strength. And then I also take hope from the fact that I think we have a richer diversity of voices than at any other point in human history in lots of ways, like to also draw on. So I feel like we're drawing from the past because of this amazing kind of time travel research and unearthings that was happening in, both sort of traditional histories and also art, excavating buried art forms. But also, like, when I was interviewing Anoni said, Anoni's a trans musician, and she said, like, at no other point in history would I ever have a platform to even be able to say these things. Like, I would have been burned at the stake. And I sometimes think about the fact that there are a lot of people now speaking who would have been burned, institutionalized, shut up, kept out. I think the work that you do with this platform is part of that. So that's, I don't think it's magic. I don't think it happens on its own without all the hard work of organizing, but I think that it's like, we've never had more like ingredients to throw in the pot. That's the other thing, is Astra and I are really committed to.
In the witch's cauldron, it sounds like. But that's to the point, Ellie, about your point of appreciating the progress we've made, even if it's not the whole thing we wanted, right? And not, and not always just pointing out the flaws and the lack and how far we have to go, but how far we've come, and thanking those ancestors who did this, who got us here, and building on it.
Yeah, I'm happy to plug a podcast that Margaret Killjoy does called Cool People Who Did Cool Stuff. And it's kind of the answer to the Behind the Bastards, because they're part of the same network. So Behind the Bastards by Robert Evans, like, obviously goes into bastards. And what she does is she goes into cool people who did cool stuff, as the name suggests. Like everything from alter globalization movements, Zapatistas, and just random heroes from like 200 years ago, and just stuff like that. And
I would love that. I'm excited.
What else?
Addict, I can attest that it's great.
What else? I don't know, Dana? Anything we've missed?
I would just, sorry to keep talking about this novel, but Sitt Marie Rose, as I said, written in the Lebanese Civil War, it was depressing to read because we know what happens. We know, these dynamics persist, but it was also gratifying to see somebody from across time recognize the same, struggles that we are fighting and frame them in the same way. She even talks about how, the fascist vision for the world, or for Lebanon in particular, in this example, is one of making people disposable, and just all the ways in which she kind of articulates those things does actually feel gratifying and empowering, and feels like you're recognizing, an ally across time. Part of kind of the unearthing that you were talking about, Naomi. So I'll just mention that people should read that novel.
Yeah.
Oh, can I plug a novel, or?
Please.
I'm a third of the way through it, and I'm loving it so much already. It's Madeleine Tien's The Book of Records, which is also about time travel and excavations and time, and it's just incredible.
Well, if we're plugging fiction, I have a podcast on Star Trek that we launched yesterday called Resistance is Fertile, with Carla Joy Bergman, who's also a good friend and an amazing author.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Okay, say hi to her for me.
Okay, will do. And it's a play on word. It's actually very thematically relevant to what we were talking about, because one of the alien species in Star Trek, the Borg, says resistance is futile. as they absorb these alien species and whatnot and alien civilizations. And so we played the play of the Resistance is Fertile is what we're, and so we're going to explore like Star Trek episodes and stuff like that, but it's very much like conversation about the political importance of storytelling effectively, and anarchism, and just fun stuff in between is what we're going to try and do.
I gotta catch up on Star Trek. I'm an immigrant. I missed the boat on this one.
It's okay. But yeah, I just wanted to mention those. Astra, Naomi, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Naomi, for coming again, and Astra, your first time, I hope not the last. And yeah, thank you for your time.
This is great. Thank you.